There we go. Good. So welcome back again. And so any questions before I begin?
I have a question, Professor.
Yes, sure, Vincent.
Um, Last time or last class, we spoke about unrest in Boston
Hmm.
and Britain sending troops to the colonies.
Hmm.
Um, the question is, where did these troops come from? So, were they colonials or were they from Britain proper?
They were from Britain. The That's a very good question. Each colony had its own militia, and this, if you're a guy between 16 and 60, this would be part of your civic obligation to serve in the militia. And during the 7 Years' War, most adult free men did serve in the militia. Um, Britain also had an army. Now it's kind of an issue because England has a long kind of resistance to the idea of a standing army. I know you asked a pretty good question. I'm fear I'm starting to give the long answer. Um, the two regiments that came to Boston mostly were recruited in Ireland. In fact, in particular places in Ireland. Ireland then was was part of the British Empire, and so these guys were recruited in Ireland to be part of the 14th and 29th regiments. Britain has other troops on bases in the Mediterranean, but Britain isn't that big a place, so recruiting soldiers is always a difficult thing. And people would join then for a variety of reasons, just as they do now. And one being this is an opportunity. So the short answer to your question is most of these particular troops who came to Boston came from Ireland. Now, did you have more of a question or did you want to go somewhere else with that?
A follow up to that question would be, how was it possible that soldiers who weren't from the colonies, how were they, or how could they have been subjected to arrest and trial from colonial governors and officials when they weren't from the colonies?
Well, that's a very good question. It's an excellent question, in fact, and it's one that does keep coming back. It's an issue today when there are troops from one country in another country and they violate the civil law. And in this particular case, if you are in the colony, you are subject to the civil law. That is, um, civilians are not subject to military law, but it's a fundamental idea in Britain that the military is subservient to the civil power. So the prosecutions of the soldiers were actually in the name of the king. The cases are Rex versus Wemyss. Corporal Wemyss was the corporal, and Rex versus Preston. So if you are in a military force and you are in a place and you violate the law, then you are subject to the law of that place. You can imagine this does become a really contentious issue, and still does. And it's something that comes up during the Civil War as well, in that case, some civilians are subject to military law, and that's an issue the Supreme Court grapples with at the time of the Civil War. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'm glad you mentioned that because the trials of these soldiers are probably the most important trials in the history of the country. And so they're all charged with murder. Now, it's again, I can make this a long discussion and we'll spend the rest of the semester talking about the trials. In fact, this fall, the city of Quincy, which is just south of Boston, is planning a series of events commemorating these trials because three of the lawyers involved were from Quincy. Those are Samuel Quincy, who is the chief prosecutor, and his brother Josiah Quincy, who is the chief defense lawyer. And then John Adams, who is also from Quincy, also is one of the defense lawyers. You can imagine this might not be a popular thing for Quincy and Adams, and Quincy, Josiah, has become one of the leaders in the whole Whig patriot movement. In fact, his nickname is the Patriot. He is one of the leaders of the bar in Massachusetts, young leader of the bar. He's only in his late 20s, I believe, but he's really emerging as one of the leading lawyers in town, but also really committed to this emerging cause. As I said last time, we're not exactly sure where Crispus Attucks stood on all of this, or Christopher Sider, but we definitely know where Josiah Quincy was. He was against all of these attempts by the British government to exert power here. And so Josiah Quincy agrees to take the case to defend these soldiers. His father, who is one of the leading citizens, and this then was the town of Braintree, what is now Quincy, broke off from Braintree about 20 years after this. And they took the name Quincy in honor of the Quincy family, who were such a big part of its history. His father, who's also named Josiah Quincy, and he, just to keep, there are a lot of people named Josiah Quincy over the course of history, and to keep them straight, he is typically called the Colonel. And so Colonel Quincy can't believe his son is taking the case of these soldiers that everyone in town wants to hang because of what they did. And Josiah Quincy explains that it's essential to give these guys a fair trial. And he also enlists John Adams in this. Now, Adams, in his autobiography, later has something of a different recollection of how he came to defend the soldiers. He recollects that a guy, an Irish merchant in Boston, who was a friend of Captain Preston, came and appealed to him and said, here's this guy sitting in jail, doesn't have a friend in the place. He's going on trial for his life, and he can't find a lawyer to defend him. And Adams, in his recollection, said, counsel is the last thing the accused should need in a free country. As someone who's on trial for his life. And so Adams will take the case. And then the guy says, well, of course he's innocent. And Adams says, that is for the jury to decide. So Quincy and Adams undertake to defend these guys. And what they're doing is actually something, Samuel Adams, by the way, sits behind the prosecution table. He is passing suggestions to the lawyers who are, let me show you some interesting pictures of all of this, if I may. He really wants these guys to hang. He wants to make an example of them. Adams and Quincy are defending them. And okay, so here we have the bloody massacre. And here we have Josiah Quincy on the left and John Adams on the right. And Quincy and Adams know the bigger issue here is who is going to govern. And the reason the troops are here, remember, is that the British government and Governor Francis Bernard have said, this place can't be governed. You need military force. And what they're going to show is that a jury here can hear the evidence and decide whether they're innocent, guilty or not guilty. So if these guys get a fair trial, it demonstrates that you don't need military force here. Because here you have these soldiers who shoot down unarmed civilians in the street and kill 5 of them. They get a fair trial. By the way, Samuel Adams had orchestrated a funeral for these victims, and they all are buried together in the Granary burying ground, in the same place where Christopher Sider had been buried 2 weeks earlier. And this is all at town expense. So the 4 victims, Patrick Carr, who is from Ireland, he actually dies on the day of the funeral, and he later is buried with them. But a few days after this event, you have the bodies of Crispus Attucks and Benjamin Caldwell, who were strangers in town. Their bodies are carried out of Faneuil Hall. Samuel Maverick and Thomas Gray, who's the rope worker, their bodies were taken from their homes, and these processions carrying them met in front of the old State House and then processed down to the Liberty Tree at Boston Neck, and then around the Liberty Tree, and then up through the Common to the Granary, and 10,000 people follow them. The population of Boston was about 12,000 people. So you have this tremendous public funeral put on as a demonstration. And the soldiers now are basically in hiding. They're ultimately pulled out to Castle Island, and these, except for these 8 who are on trial for their lives. And Adams and Quincy are going to defend both Captain Preston and the soldiers in trials that are going to happen separately. Long legal reason why they keep putting off the date of the trial until the fall of 1770. And the trial happens in the courthouse on Court Street. And so arguing the case for the defense are John Adams and Josiah Quincy, and for the prosecution, Samuel Quincy, Josiah's older brother, and Robert Treat Payne. And Payne is another of the patriots. He is from the South Shore. And it's a tremendous trial. And it's actually one of the first trials in North America that goes longer than a day. That is, the trial of Captain Preston goes on for about a week, and then the trial of the soldiers goes on for about a week. Neither Preston nor the soldiers testify, but you have witnesses for the prosecution saying that these soldiers were firing on an unarmed crowd, and soldiers for the defense showing that actually this was a violent mob attacking them. The soldiers were under attack and they had the right to defend themselves. And Adams talks about press mob. What if a press gang came to Boston? Wouldn't people have a right to defend themselves? No, there had been press gangs in Boston. In fact, in 1768, he had defended a couple of sailors who were Irish guys who had stowed away on a vessel and killed a press agent who was coming to seize them. And in 1748, there was another press gang attacked by a mob in Boston. Of course, Bostonians thought, you're justified in doing this. But he's showing that these soldiers are really under attack here. And tremendous defense. And you can also imagine, if you're the lawyer for Captain Preston, the main charge there is he ordered the men to fire. Well, you simply show he didn't order the men to fire. And then it's the fault of these men. But these guys are defending both Preston and the soldiers. And in each case, they establish that Preston didn't fire, the men were under attack, and the jury finds the soldiers not guilty. Except for two, Private Montgomery and another private who are standing there. There are witnesses. Another argument is, can you show which bullet fired by which soldier hit which person? Of course, for some townspeople, that doesn't matter. All of these soldiers are guilty. But wait a minute. How about if can you show that this guy's gun hit this person? Well, Montgomery and Kilroy are both standing in the front, and Crispus Attucks and Mr. Gray are standing in the front. Their guns are right in front of them. And so, yeah, these guys shot Gray and Attucks. And so they are found guilty of manslaughter, which is also a hangable offense in 1770. And in this case, Adams, the lawyer for the defense, pleads benefit of clergy. This is a old, long-standing custom. This kind of gets back to the question Vincent asked earlier. Clergy could not be tried in civil courts in medieval England. So if you were a member of the clergy, you could not be tried. You could only be tried by an ecclesiastical court. How do we know you're a member of the clergy? Well, if you can read, that's evidence that you're a member of the clergy. And so if you are able to read, and in fact, typically the test would be a certain psalm, it's a psalm of mercy. I think it's Psalm 51, but check it before you're hauled into court and want to use this. And it might behoove you to memorize this particular psalm if you can't read. And so they plead benefit of clergy, and thus Montgomery and Kilroy are not hanged. They are, however, branded on the thumbs. And you're branded with an M for manslaughter, which means the next time you're accused of something, you can't say, hey, I can plead benefit of clergy. They say, well, wait a minute, you've already done that once. It's not, you can't keep the get out of jail free card. All the branding on the thumb is not being, well, I haven't been branded on the thumb, so I can't say what a severe punishment it is. But then by this time, the rest of the troops have all gone to New Jersey. So I like to say they were branded on the thumbs and sent to New Jersey. And isn't that punishment enough for anyone? And as he's getting on the boat, Montgomery says, yes, I did fire. And this is the first time he admits it. But by this time, he's on his way out of town and the trial ends. But in March of 1771, Boston begins an active way of remembering this event. They illuminate windows. They put up, they do woodcuts of the Revere engraving of the scene. And they have orations at noon on March 5th of 1771. All the church bells in town toll. Thomas Hutchinson is at his home in Milton, and he can hear the church bells ringing. And he says, this shows how badly people understand what actually happened on March 5th. That is, they're commemorating this, not as a riot that got out of hand, but as this attack by the soldiers. And there is an oration given by a guy named John Lovell, who is a teacher at Boston Latin School. And then every year, Boston will commemorate the massacre, as it's called. There's also a political point, a really potent issue here. Ebenezer Richardson, the guy who shot Christopher Sider, has not been tried. The governor realizes there's no way we can spare Richardson if he goes to trial. It's one reason the massacre trial is postponed, because Richardson's trial should have come first, but they want to keep delaying it. And they do spirit Richardson out of town. And this becomes a grievance for the town. You'll see in some of the engravings about commemorating the massacre in 72, 73, the fact that Richardson has still not been hanged is really a grievance we have. So that's the trial. And Boston is commemorating this, but Boston is also calm, relatively calm. It does have the effect of calming things down. So we like to talk about the massacre as the first event that leads to the revolution, but then you wonder, well, what happened next? Why didn't the revolution start then? No one, of course, in 1770 knew there was going to be a revolution. So it's a time, though, put to good use to organize things. And here's one thing that happens. John Adams, by this time, actually late in the summer of 1770, he's elected to the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly. And his wife, Abigail, is quite upset with this because, imagine this. He's taken this big case, which he doesn't get paid for, defending Captain Preston and the soldiers. Later on, he actually sees Preston on the street in London, and Preston pretends not to recognize him. Of course, Adams would have been wearing a wig at the trial. And Adams is a member of the assembly, and Abigail was upset when he got elected because finally his law practice is taking off. And you can imagine, you are one of the counsel in the biggest case, and you have these guys everyone in town wants to hang, acquitted. Boy, people are going to look for you as a lawyer. He is a very good lawyer. But now he's been elected to the assembly, which is going to take up a lot of his time with the mundane things the assembly has to do. And Abigail knows this is actually going to cause the family fortunes to dwindle. In fact, by the time Adams becomes so busy in politics, he can't handle his law practice. He turns the practice over to someone else. And 30 years later, that man is one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts. Being a lawyer, a lot more lucrative than being in public life, as Adams is. However, he is a member of the assembly. And here is something else that happens in this period. After these soldiers are acquitted, the British Parliament says, boy, we really dodged a bullet on that one. Because here you have these guys who are carrying out their duties under the law, and they're charged with murder in one of these provinces. What happens the next time? You can't have John Adams and Josiah Quincy in every place stepping forward to defend these various British officials. So the British government says, well, how about if instead of having the provinces pay the judges, Parliament pays the judges? That will mean the judges aren't dependent on the whims of these various assemblies, but they're dependent on Parliament. And will make the judges less partial to the whims of these assemblies. This raises a big problem. I usually hesitate to talk too much about this for fear someone from the current legislature will overhear and say, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could get someone else to pay these various officials? But in the Massachusetts Assembly, this raises really a profound issue, because if the judges, the same issue, reason Parliament wants to pay them, this will make the judges dependent on Parliament rather than the Assembly. And here you have a very important argument against doing this, and that is contained in this document that in this portrait of Samuel Adams, he is pointing to. This is the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. This sets up the governing power in Massachusetts. And according to the charter, it is the Assembly that pays the judges. Now, one of the real fundamental ideas people here in Massachusetts are developing is that you have to have a written charter that spells out what the rules are, and this controls the government. Parliament, of course, is a different idea about what controls the government. Parliament governs in England. Parliament is the sovereign power or the supreme power in England. Well, technically the king in Parliament, but by this time, Parliament is really running the show. And Parliament decides what the British Constitution means. The British Constitution is tradition and custom and things that Parliament decides would be in the best interest of everyone. And it's really at this moment that Parliament is changing this idea about how Britain will be governed. And here in these colonies, you do have these charters which spell out how we will be governed. And so what Samuel Adams is doing here, this is a great portrait by John Singleton Copley that hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts. And this was done probably, I suspect John Hancock paid for this portrait. And here he is pointing to this charter. This is the law here. In this hand, he is holding the instructions of the town of Boston. That is, Samuel Adams represents the town of Boston in the assembly. The people of Boston instruct their representatives. This hand is resting on the minute books of the town of Boston. So you have this fundamental idea here that power comes from these people, and it is spelled out in this charter that controls everybody. And Adams is their representative. So this is the story of this portrait. And here you have the British Parliament saying, no, we're going to pay the judges now. And the Assembly says, no, Parliament can't pay the judges. Of course, the Assembly can't really write to Parliament and say, hey, you can't pay the judges. The only effect they really have is here. And so what happens is, by the way, another thing Samuel Adams is doing in this period, he is the clerk for the town of Boston. He's also a member of the Assembly and a clerk in the Assembly. And as the clerk in Boston and as a leader in the Assembly, he has the Boston Town Meeting create a committee of correspondence. And they write to other towns, that is, to other town meetings. Each town has a board of selectmen selected by the town meeting, or a moderator who presides over the town meeting. And they say, the town should start a committee of correspondence, members of the town meeting, who then will correspond with other towns. And this is creating a communications network among the towns of Massachusetts. And the people on these committees tend to be people who think similarly to the way Samuel Adams thinks. And the Massachusetts Assembly also creates a committee of correspondence. Assemblies have all kinds of committees. Committee on Ways and Means is usually the most important. And so he creates a committee of correspondence in the Massachusetts Assembly, and then they write to the other assemblies saying, you should start a committee of correspondence so we can all keep in touch. And by the end of 1773, early 1773, all of the colonies have committees of correspondence. So you have Samuel Adams creating this communications network and using that as a way of getting the Boston version of events to the rest of the colonies and to the rest of the towns in Massachusetts. So you have this big issue about who's going to pay the judges. And here in Boston, they put pressure on they call on all of the judges and say, do you really want to accept a salary from the crown? Because a salary from the crown violates the charter, and it would be really a bad thing for you to do. And all of the judges in Massachusetts say, no, we're not going to accept this salary. In some cases, it borders on intimidation. James Otis Sr. is a judge in Barnstable, and several hundred people show up at the court and say, we won't let the court sit until you refuse this salary. And Otis and the other judges say, absolutely, we're going to refuse the salary. Every judge in Massachusetts does refuse the salary except for one. And that one is, let's see, Peter Oliver. This is Judge Peter Oliver, who is the Chief Justice of the Superior Court. And this is his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Now, the Hutchinsons and the Olivers are closely connected families. And Thomas Hutchinson, you'll recall, had been Lieutenant Governor, and he had been actually Chief Justice at the same time he was Lieutenant Governor in the 1760s. And then in 1771, Hutchinson becomes the governor and realizes you can't be governor as well as Chief Justice. It would just be too much work. So Peter Oliver becomes the Chief Justice. And Peter Oliver's younger brother, Andrew, is the secretary of the province. Now, Hutchinson and Andrew Oliver had married two sisters, and thus they are connected by marriage. And Hutchinson's sons, Thomas Hutchinson Jr. and Elisha Hutchinson, in the early 1770s, married Peter Oliver's daughters. And then in 1773, Hutchinson's daughter married Andrew Oliver's grandson. No one but a Hutchinson or an Oliver married a Hutchinson or an Oliver. And also after 1761, no one but a Hutchinson or an Oliver was either Lieutenant Governor or Chief Justice in Massachusetts. In some ways, by the way, later on, Peter Oliver winds up going to England in March of 1776. And in England, he writes a history of the Revolution, explains what happened. And in his way of thinking, the whole problem was Boston. And the problem in Boston was you had Samuel Adams and James Otis leading these mobs because they absolutely hated Thomas Hutchinson. It's true that they hated Thomas Hutchinson. Peter Oliver said they brought down the whole system out of their virulent hatred of Thomas Hutchinson. And there is certainly a grain of truth in that. It seems in many, it's almost unbelievable to us how badly Thomas Hutchinson comes across in what they're writing. I think it may be one of the reasons I tend to be sympathetic to Hutchinson, as I think I mentioned. He was an historian. And one thing historians do is write dull books, and another thing we do is give dull lectures, and Hutchinson did both of those with great aplomb. And he becomes the most vilified figure in Boston in this period. And Oliver sees all of this whipped up by Adams and Otis, really for personal petty reasons we don't need to get into right now. So you have Oliver saying, I'm going to accept the salary, because being Chief Justice takes him away from his main business, which was he was an iron manufacturer from Easton. And so he's having to ride circuit around the province from Maine to Cape Cod. The courts generally were held in taverns. And, you know, he would sleep upstairs. Usually all of the lawyers traveled around together to hear these cases. And these are pretty mundane cases. You may think Chief Justice of the Superior Court, he must be grappling with really weighty issues. It's really not, you know, because they travel around to hear cases. And if you had some problem with a neighbor, you're going to wait till the court comes around. It's kind of like Judge Judy, you know, riding circuit. You're hearing these really petty problems of people when he has a lot of other things he could be doing. So he says, I'll accept the 200 pounds a year, which doesn't make up for what I lose by performing this piece of service. Okay, so Oliver says, I'm going to accept the salary. What can we do now? They can't intimidate Peter Oliver. John Adams, who's a member of the assembly, says, well, we can impeach him. Well, that is something no assembly has ever done. And in fact, other members of the assembly say that won't work because no assembly has impeached a crown official. And also, impeachment is something Parliament does. The House of Commons votes impeachment, and the House of Lords hears the case. Well, we don't have a House of Lords here. What we have is a council, a governor's council made up of 25 people. And presiding over the council is Governor Hutchinson, Peter Oliver's brother-in-law. As the secretary of the council is Andrew Oliver, Peter Oliver's brother. And what will happen when this case gets to the council is Governor Hutchinson will say, you don't have any power to impeach Crown officials. That's the end of it. And Adams says, doesn't matter what happens. We have to take that step. So they do. In 1772, they impeach Judge Oliver. And then what happens is just what I said would happen. It gets to the council, nothing happens. Hutchinson throws the case out. However, a few months later, Judge Oliver goes out to Worcester to hear cases. There is a courthouse in Worcester. And remember, Oliver thinks the whole problem is Boston. And the problem in Boston is Samuel Adams and the Boston mob that he seems to control. Well, these jurors in Worcester, mainly farmers, come into the courthouse, and the first thing that happens is the judge will impanel a jury, and these jurors all look over at Judge Hutchinson, Judge Oliver, and they say, you've been impeached by our assembly. We can't serve in a court until this has been resolved. Well, according to Oliver and Hutchinson, it has been resolved. The assembly had no power to impeach judges. But according to these ordinary farmers in Worcester, it hasn't been resolved because the council hasn't heard this as a case. So they get up and walk out. They say, we can't serve in a court you're presiding over. Imagine that. If you're ever, by the way, called to jury duty, I strongly suggest you don't look at the judge and say, hey, you're not qualified to serve, I'm out of here. You'll be found in contempt of court. But Oliver discovers he can't impanel jurors in Massachusetts. There's really something happening here in the way people are thinking about who governs and their relationship to government. So if we were sitting around in 1773 talking about the big issues of the day, probably the big one would be the impeachment of judges. It's a tremendous issue. Of course, it's not one that's going to ring out if you're trying to reenact things and so on, because it is really a legal argument, political argument, constitutional argument, but it is the most fundamental argument here going on. Now, there's another issue too. Well, actually, here is probably the most important event in terms of understanding what happens in, let me make sure I get the right slideshow here for you. No, this is the same one we were just looking at. My apologies. One of these days, I will figure out how to do all of this, and we'll all be happier. Okay, here we go. Yes. That was not what I wanted to do, so we'll just improvise. Okay. Yes. Has anyone seen this man before?
No, sir.
No. Okay. He died in 1773, and his death is actually one of the most significant events that is going to affect what happens in what follows. This is a man named Thomas Whately, and Mr. Whately had been the secretary to Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the guy responsible for the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend duties in 1767, these various tax laws. And when Parliament passed these tax laws and Americans had all of these protests, Whately wanted to know why they were doing this. Now, so he starts writing to people in America who can explain. He doesn't write to James Otis. And by the way, by this time, James Otis was out of his mind. He was insane, had a mental breakdown, I should say. And then he doesn't write to Samuel Adams because actually before 1771, no one really had heard of Samuel Adams. Adams very much liked to work behind the scenes. So he writes to Thomas Hutchinson. Why are people protesting about all of this? And Hutchinson writes back. and explains why people are doing what they're doing and why they are wrong in doing what they're doing and why Parliament is actually right. Because here, Hutchinson knows really important to have the secretary to the Chancellor of the Exchequer reading your letters. And Hutchinson unburdens himself. Here is a sympathetic ear in England, someone he really can speak to. And Whately has all these letters from Hutchinson, which help him understand the American situation, and then he dies. Now, his next door neighbor is a friend of, or these are some of the things that Hutchinson says in his letters. In 1774, people in Rhode Island didn't like this British revenue schooner, the Gaspee. I mentioned John Robinson trying to collect taxes in Rhode Island in the 1760s. By the early 1770s, the British government sends a revenue cutter to stop ships, much more effective than to say, hey, dock here and we'll send someone aboard to count. And so what happens in 1774 is people in Rhode Island, or must have been 72. Is anyone from Rhode Island? If there is someone from Rhode Island, I would let you tell the story of the Gaspee, this revenue schooner that goes too close to shore. And some of the locals in Rhode Island, who also have boats and are actually, these are their native waters, run it aground and burn it. So here's this revenue schooner that's been collecting taxes in Rhode Island, and the people in Rhode Island burn it. Well, here, Hutchinson says, here, you've heard about the burning of the Gaspee. If there's another attempt, I hope that some of the ringleaders can be taken prisoner directly to England. Few of them standing trial and execution dock would be an effectual preventative of any further attempts. Wow, he wants to get tough with these people, right? And then this whole idea here that's circulating in these assemblies, that these assemblies really are able to govern these places and not Parliament. He says the denial of the supremacy of Parliament by the Lilliputian assemblies of America can never be justified or excused. I should say that Hutchinson opened the assembly in 1773. This had been a period of relative calm. And Hutchinson thought this would be a good time for me, the professorial Professor Hutchinson, to explain to the assembly what their role was in the British Empire. And their role in the British Empire was pretty minuscule. They did not govern in Massachusetts. The British Parliament did. He explains this emerging theory of the empire in a speech that goes on for 2 days. This is why I mentioned he probably would have been a history professor, or maybe a government professor later on, if had he lived in a different era. Gives this long speech, a long lecture actually, to the members of the assembly, that they don't govern Massachusetts, the British Parliament does. This, it might have worked if this was a pretty dull class of undergraduates learning from Professor Hutchinson. It doesn't work because each of these guys had been elected by his town to look out for the interests of his town. And now Governor Hutchinson is saying, you really don't have any power. It's Parliament that governs, not you. This gets the assembly really annoyed. This is kind of background. And I know I haven't finished telling you about poor Thomas Whately and his death, because when Hutchinson tells the assembly, you don't govern here, Parliament does, the assembly says, hey, you know what? Back in 1768, we had a fight with Governor Bernard. I mentioned that last time. And the assembly actually asked that Bernard be recalled, have another governor sent. And that's exactly what happened. Hutchinson is now the governor because Bernard had failed. And it's thought that Hutchinson, a guy who is from here, knows the history, knows the people, he'll be able to get along with these folks. And in many cases he does, except of course when it really matters. And here he is writing to Thomas Whately about the Lilliputian. Do we all know what Lilliputians are? I should phrase this differently. Does anyone not know what a Lilliputian is?
Yeah, I don't know.
It means like trivial, right?
Yeah, where does it come from?
See, I can't give you. I looked it up to be honest.
Okay. Okay. One of the greatest books in the English language by Jonathan Swift called Gulliver's Travels. And Gulliver goes to these different worlds, and one is the world of the Lilliputians, who are tiny people, and they tie him up. Okay, so they're tiny, insignificant people. And then in another world, he goes to the place of giants, and he is a tiny person, and and he tries to explain British politics to this giant who's holding him up and saying, "Are you a Whig or a Tory?" Thinking it's ridiculous. And so, yes. Ainsley, by the way, has just reminded us that there is a reenactment of the burning of the Gaspee in Rhode Island, and she'll probably be able to tell us more about that, which sounds like a great event. I mean, burning this ship in Narragansett Bay. So, so you can see, you can reenact something like that the way you can't the impeachment of a judge or the assembly arguing with the governor, these kinds of things. But here's Governor Hutchinson calling them Lilliputians, other things. And what happens, just to make a long, interminable story shorter, is the next door neighbor to Thomas Whately's executor happens to be hosting Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin is in London as the agent of the Massachusetts Assembly. Remember, he had been sent, the Pennsylvania Assembly had sent him to London back in the 1750s to be their lobbyist in England. And he loved being in England, so he stayed and stayed and stayed, went home briefly in the mid-1760s, then came back. And so here he is, the agent, and other assemblies say, hey, he would be a good lobbyist for us too. His son's the governor of New Jersey, so Franklin is the lobbyist for the New Jersey Assembly and the Georgia Assembly. And now the Massachusetts Assembly has asked him to have Governor Hutchinson recalled. So he set up a hearing of the Privy Council that is going to consider the Massachusetts Assembly's reasons for wanting someone other than Hutchinson as the governor. Hutchinson has lost their confidence. They can't get along with him. Send someone else. It's not a high priority for the Privy Council, so they schedule a hearing for January of 1774. Now, meanwhile, the guy next door says, hey, look, I just found all of these letters from Thomas Hutchinson. Isn't that the guy Franklin's been telling us about, to Thomas Whately? Here he's saying all kinds of things about the Massachusetts Assembly, Lilliputians, and he has other things to say about various political figures here. Wouldn't the Massachusetts Assembly be really interested in what Governor Hutchinson is saying about them behind their backs? So he gives all of these letters to Franklin. And Franklin says, okay, by the way, who owns these letters? Or let me put it this way. Let us suppose Dylan Gale writes a letter to Jake Roach talking about what an unbelievable bore Professor Allison is. And I think he might actually be a Martian or something like that. I'm not gonna tell you what to think. And so he writes that to Jake. Does Jake legally have the authority, the power to publish that letter, say in the Suffolk Journal or post it on Twitter? Who owns a letter once it's written?
You do?
The person it was sent to.
No, it's actually the person who wrote it.
Yeah, right.
So Hutchinson's letters belong to Hutchinson, no matter to whom he sent them, okay? And he doesn't mean for these to be published. Franklin knows this. Remember, Franklin is also the postmaster for America. He understands these things. However, he thinks it's important that Samuel Adams and the Assembly also get this as background. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this particular story. One of the most important is about not writing things that you don't want everyone to know, which is why I think Twitter and Facebook can be such dangerous things, because we think I'm just talking to a small circle of friends. Here, Hutchinson thinks I'm just writing to Thomas Whately, and he's certainly not going to share these letters with anyone. And so Franklin sends these to the Massachusetts Assembly, but explains these are private letters. Under no circumstances can they be made public. Okay, Franklin's quite clear. Under no circumstances, private letters. There's for your information. Samuel Adams knows what to do with letters that cannot be made public. Okay, they can't be printed. So what we're going to do is close the doors of the assembly so no one else can get in, and we're going to have them read to the 200 members of the assembly. Of course, these 200 people can go out and tell anyone they want what they heard, and they hear all kinds of things in these letters. They hear that bit about the few ringleaders tried in execution dock, and what else do they hear in this? No, that's not it. Our last ships. Okay. One thing Hutchinson says is you can't expect to move 3,000 miles away from England and still enjoy all the rights of Englishmen. And he also says maybe they should be crushed a little bit, and then they'll appreciate English liberty. Wow, you don't enjoy all the rights of Englishmen because you've moved out of England? And it's a legitimate point. We can see it sounds somewhat different when Thomas Hutchinson is saying it to an official in England. And by the way, members of the assembly hear this, they go off and report on it. And then after a couple of weeks, Samuel Adams announces, we found another set of these that don't have the same reasons for secrecy. We can publish these, which they do. This is probably the best-selling book that the Massachusetts legislature ever publishes, The Letters of Thomas Hutchinson, published in the spring of 1773. And here is one of the first ones, which reports on Hancock's sloop being seized. This is tremendous. This is really, it destroys Hutchinson's reputation here. In fact, he asks if he can come home to England. He always referred to England as home, to plead his case. And so actually he was going to leave in 1774, but this ruins Hutchinson, and absolutely, so he is pretty much ruined publicly. Here's actually, this is the almanac for the year 1773. I'm sorry, I meant to show you a different picture. Here we go. Caption is "The Wicked Statesman in the Hour of His Death." Here is Hutchinson. You see, he's sitting at a writing desk writing, and you have the snake here and the serpent. This is death. Here's the devil holding up his list of crimes. This is a guy who I said in a different life would have been my college professor, mild-mannered Thomas Hutchinson. The guy was asked to be governor because it seemed like he could help hold things together. But he utterly fails, and it's really beyond his control, I think. So this is the way he's being depicted, this arch villain who is, so that is one thing happening. And then something that has really little bearing on Massachusetts is this, because if you're sitting around in London, unless you're Benjamin Franklin, and you have to argue this case before the Privy Council in January about Hutchinson and the Assembly, the big issue is tea. In fact, the East India Company, which is the largest corporation in the world. And it had, by this time, taken over the government of much of India. The pink you see in this map is territory governed by the East India Company. And this is, by the way, if any of you wants to be an accountant, does anyone want to be an accountant? It's actually quite a lucrative field. I have a colleague in the accounting department who would begin classes by saying, 5 of you are going to become accounting majors. And for years, my wife said, you should do the same thing. Say, 5 of you are going to become history majors. And then I was talking to Professor Whalen one day and saying, I thought that was a great line. And he said, they didn't tell you the rest of the line, which is 5 of you will become accounting majors. The rest of you are going to work for accounting majors. These are business students. I don't think I could, with honesty, say that 5 of you should become history majors and the rest of you are going to work for history majors, but it's something we all aspire to. Anyway, the East India Company, a guy named Robert Clive, goes to India as an accountant with the East India Company and winds up taking over the government in India, leading armies against recalcitrant states in India that didn't want to be governed by the company. And by the early 1770s, the East India Company is in control of much of India. And they're using India to ship tea, and later they'll ship opium to tea from China to Britain, opium from India to China. And they are the wealthiest, largest corporation in the world. And the problem is taking on all of this administrative business in India is expensive. And the company has gone through most of its cash holdings and is on the brink of bankruptcy. So here you have the largest corporation in the world on the brink of bankruptcy. I don't think the phrase too big to fail came up at this time, but the company goes to the Prime Minister, Lord North, and says, look, we've taken over the government of India and now we're nearly broke. Can Parliament do something? And North says yes. Parliament will bail out the company. Parliament will loan the company 15 million pounds. But as part of this, the Prime Minister will get to appoint the board of directors of the company. This is tremendously lucrative for Lord North and for Parliament because they're going to take over this company. Also, as a way of helping the company get over its short-term cash flow problem, they can send tea directly to British North America and the tea won't have to pay the customs duties there. Back in 1770, Parliament had rescinded those taxes from 1768, but then said, we're going to keep the tax on tea just to show that we can tax these people. So that's the only tax left. However, the company's not going to have to pay it. Also, the company will have a monopoly on all the tea sold in British North America. Now, the Americans have begun drinking tea, which is very much an English thing. And so there are tea merchants in Massachusetts and in other places. Mainly the tea they're getting is not from the East India Company. The Dutch, the French are smuggling tea, and this would be your real source of tea here. But now the company, and actually the Parliament, is going to determine who will be the tea merchants. And in Boston, actually, there are 5 tea merchants. 2 of them are Thomas Hutchinson's sons, Elijah and Thomas Jr. Another one is a fellow named Clark. Richard Clark. John Singleton Copley's father-in-law, Richard Clark, is another tea merchant. Benjamin Faneuil is a tea merchant. A guy named Winslow from down in Plymouth is a tea merchant. In each of the colonial ports, Parliament designates certain people to be tea merchants, which means if you've just been getting tea from other sources, you're now out of luck. You can't sell it. Merchants in Philadelphia say this is patently unfair. And what the Philadelphians are really worried about is those Bostonians are going to cut the deal. We say we should refuse to receive any of this tea, but we know those New Englanders are ready to do business with any. There's a real elemental distrust between New Englanders and everyone else. The term Yankee, by the way, is a kind of a pejorative Dutch term, I think, and means a sharp dealer. These New Englanders are known as being sharp dealers, always looking out for their own self-interest, really good traders. And not to denigrate the New Englanders, they're also thought of as a bunch of religious fanatics. It's kind of an uneasy partnership of a sharp dealing business person who's also a religious fanatic. Typically, that's not a good combination. Well, it is a good combination if you're the sharp dealing religious fanatic. So what happens is the Philadelphia merchants say, shouldn't receive any of this tea. And a huge ship carrying about 900 chests of tea is on its way to Philadelphia. They sail in the early part of September. Another big ship carrying about 900 chests is on its way to New York. Another ship with about 900 chests is on its way to Charleston, South Carolina. 4 smaller ships are on their way to Boston. And it's just by chance that the first of these ships, the Dartmouth, reaches Boston first on the November the 28th of 1773. The Dartmouth comes into Boston Harbor. The town meeting is convened to deliberate on what should happen with the Dartmouth. And the town meeting says none of the tea should be unloaded. By the way, before this happens, I'm sorry for keep backtracking. Well, actually, it's after this happens, so we're in good stead here. The ship arrives, the Dartmouth arrives, And news of the Dartmouth's arrival had arrived first. Actually, a ship that John Hancock owned brought Jonathan Clark, who is a son of Richard Clark, home. There's a family reunion. The Clarks live in a rented house where the Benjamin Franklin statue now stands in front of the old city hall on School Street. And they're having a family gathering there when suddenly outside they hear the mob approaching. They hear the trumpet. They hear Joyce Jr. whistling. And several hundred people surround the house. They start tearing off the shutters and the shingles. Someone fires a gun out of the second floor window, and that disperses the crowd. You can see what you could be anticipating here is more of that kind of violence we saw in the 1760s. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the organizers of this realized if we simply do what we used to do, pull down their house, tear down their warehouse, that's going to look really wrong. We're trying to show that we have legitimate grievances and we just don't want to beat up these people and destroy property. So the ship arrives, the Dartmouth arrives, the town meeting says none of the tea can be unloaded, and they post guards over the ship. 2 squads of 25 men each will be in a 12-hour rotation for each one to make sure nothing gets unloaded. The ship initially had been docked behind the Montague, which is a British warship. They have it towed to Griffin's Wharf, which is near where the Intercontinental Hotel is now on what's the Fort Point Channel. And there is kept watch over. And then the town meeting convenes. And so many people want to come to the town meeting, they open it up. They say, it's going to be a meeting of the body of the people held at Old South Meeting House. And what the meeting wants to happen is for the Clarks, Winslow, Faneuil, the Hutchinsons, to resign their commission as tea agents. Same thing that had happened when they got Andrew Oliver to resign. You're not going to sell any tea. And they say, you know, it's really not our tea. That is, they had been sent this tea by the East India Company, and they're not going to get paid until they've sold the tea. And thus, it's not really our tea. The town says, we want you to turn the tea over, to have the tea sent back. They say, well, we can't do that because then we'll be charged for it. Also, the guys who own the ship say, we'll be charged. One of the guys who owns the ship is a guy named Roach, who lives in New Bedford. He owns a lot of ships. He says, look, I've just had to bring this tea over here, and if I send it back, I'm going to have to pay for that voyage too, and I'm not going to get anything. At this meeting, big meeting held in the Old South Meeting House, Josiah Quincy says, you know, you've got a point. How about if we raise money to pay you for shipping the tea back and forth? I'll pledge 50 pounds. And someone shouts from the balcony, you talk really well, Mr. Quincy, but you don't show us your money. There's a suspicion that he's being put up to this by Roach, that Roach has given him money so that then he can get everybody else to contribute. Well, why should we do that? John Rowe, who is a Boston merchant, says that let me just give you some of this background of British law, which makes this one of the reasons things happen the way they do. Under British law, a ship can remain in port for 20 days without unloading its cargo. If it stays longer than 20 days, all of the cargo has to be inspected and taxed, because then the presumption is they haven't been sitting here just holding their cargo, they've probably been selling stuff. So you have 20 days when you don't have to get your cargo taxed and inspected and so on. So we know that. So on November the 28th, when the ships arrived, that clock started. 20 days after that, this ship either has to have sailed, and in which case it can take all of its cargo with it, or it has to unload its cargo and have its cargo taxed. So that's what's going to happen. After 20 days, the ship has to be unloaded and customs duties have to be paid. People in this town meeting are saying, if we pay the customs duties, that shows that we think Parliament can pass this particular law. And people in other places are saying similar things. John Dickinson in Pennsylvania writes this pamphlet. And there, the real enemy is not necessarily whoever is bringing the tea or the merchant here. It's the East India Company. And Dickinson says, look at what the East India Company's done in India. Bengal is one of the wealthiest places in the world. For the last 3 years, they've been having a famine because the company is turning everything into growing tea. If we allow the company to tax us, we're allowing them to govern us, and we will be in as bad a situation as people are in Bengal. Really making this argument very explicit about Parliament allowing this company to take power here. And that's really the issue here with the tea. It's the company, and it is Parliament, and the company and Parliament operating in unison. You know, when tours start operating, I guarantee you can stand out on the street, you can hear the trolleys and duck boats go by, and you'll hear someone talking about the king sending tea. The king has nothing to do with it. Or the king's ships that brought the tea. These are all American ships that are bringing the tea. And the problem isn't the king, the problem is the company that is going to become an empire. By the way, in the 1970s, a filmmaker named George Lucas heard all of this and thought, isn't that an interesting story about a company that becomes an empire? And so he did a whole series of films about this very thing, where a company, and then you see the imperial senate is dissolved, and instead of honor governing, it's going to be force. You know, so it's a story oft told and often told in different ways. So here you have the tea sitting in Boston, and 2 more ships arrived. They're all kept under guard. And every night there is one of these big meetings at Old South Meeting House. They moved there because it's the biggest building in town. At one of these meetings, Governor Hutchinson, by the way, the consignees of the tea go to the governor's council and say, hey, can you take possession of the tea and have it stored at Castle Island? And they say, well, no, we really couldn't do that. And they send the sheriff to this big meeting, Sheriff Greenleaf, and Sheriff Greenleaf goes and reads a proclamation from the governor that this is an illegal gathering. You all have to go home. And 5,000 people hiss at the sheriff. I don't know if you've ever had 5,000 people hissing. Actually, we can try this. I'm going to unmute all of you. And let me see if I can do this. And we can all hiss and see what it sounds, see how loud we can get this. Not everyone is unmuted. We have to show a little, we have to do this with a little more energy. Some of you, I think, have tuned out. The hissing, imagine that. And the merchants go to the town meeting and ask for the town to do something for them. And the town meeting simply adjourns. You know, this is really a scary thing if you're one of these merchants, because we went there to talk to the town meeting. The town meeting said, we're now adjourned. But now you have 5,000 people there who really don't like you, and they want you to give up the tea. They actually want you to leave town. In fact, they do. The town meeting later declares all of these people to be enemies of the people. One of the young Hutchinson's wife is 9 months pregnant. They go down to Plymouth and go to Plymouth in a snowstorm. People in Plymouth hear that Hutchinson's here, and they call on him and they say, you have to leave town. This is about 10 o'clock at night. It's a blizzard. He says, well, look, my wife is 9 months pregnant. They say, okay, you can stay until tomorrow morning. At 6:30 the next morning, they're back, wanting to know why they're hanging around. We told you to get out by morning. So it's an extraordinarily difficult thing for these guys, these tea merchants. First, you know, the sheriff is hissed at, the town meeting adjourns, after declaring us enemies of the people. And some of them actually go out to Castle Island, where they will be under the protection of a small British garrison there, and well as Admiral Montague has a ship. And what happens ultimately is this: we all know that the 18th of December is the day by which these ships have to have sailed. December 17th was a mass meeting at the Old South, and someone, actually John Singleton Copley, goes to call on Governor Hutchinson to ask if he will allow the ships to sail. And Hutchinson says, no, I don't have the authority to do that. And he says the British ship might stop them if they try to sail. And so the meeting at about 7 o'clock in the evening, Copley comes back and says, I've spoken to the governor and he won't let the ships sail. Samuel Adams stands up and says, this meeting can do nothing more to save our country. Someone in the balcony lets out a war whoop. Just at that same moment, the crowd outside, this is December. There are so many people waiting outside. They have the windows open. And someone else, there's a war whoop outside. We don't know exactly who organized this, but 3 groups of people, 25 to 50 each, had met at the Green Dragon Tavern, where the Masons met, at the Eads and Gill printing shop, and a guy named Cook's carpenter shop. And these 3 groups had converged on Old South. They hear Adams say that, they hear the war whoop, those are signals. Now these 3 groups march in single file down to Griffin's Wharf. And they board these 3 ships that are tied up there. And these are guys who know how to load and unload vessels. They send people down into the hold, who then tie ropes around these. Each chest weighs about 200 pounds. These chests of tea are hauled up, and then guys on the deck using axes break them open and dump them overboard. This takes only about half an hour to 40 minutes, and people remark on how quietly and efficiently they worked, and that they are destroying the tea and nothing else. They ask the master of the ship for the manifest, and then they check off the crates of tea. And then he checks off later to make sure nothing else has been destroyed. One of the ships, the master says, look, don't start with my ship. I want to get it unloaded because the tea is actually buried under the rest of the cargo. They say, we'll take care of that. They very carefully unload the rest of the cargo, put it on the dock, and then destroy the tea. This is an extraordinary event. They learned something from the attempt to attack the Clark house, that doing this kind of non-violent but destructive act is much more effective. By the way, no one uses the phrase tea party because that makes it sound like it's kind of a fun event. They called it the destruction of the tea. The next day, John Adams says this was the most magnificent moment of all. And this was an epic in history. Hutchinson wants to have the ringleaders arrested, but no one admits to having been there. You have over 150 people actively unloading these ships, dumping the tea over, but no one will admit, yeah, I was there, because they know what they're doing is an act of high treason, as well as being really damaging to the East India Company. So that's the destruction of the tea. Now, while this is happening, John Hancock and Benjamin Church and other leaders of this resistance are still at Old South Meeting House giving speeches. So everyone knows this is where we were. We weren't down on the docks doing this. We don't know who was doing that. And we don't have any records of who planned this, who organized it. Later on, Ebenezer McIntosh says it was, he was one of the organizers, which is quite likely. These are guys who knew how to load and unload a ship, which is something John Hancock and Samuel Adams did not know how to do. So, and the guys are dressed as Mohawks. They smeared grease paint on their faces, cover themselves with blankets. They didn't want to be recognized, and they are not. Okay, later on, people do come up with lists of who was there, who participated. Paul Revere takes off later that night with a written account of what happened, brings it to New York, where the Sons of Liberty say, okay, this is what we have to do when the ship comes in. We have to destroy the tea. And then someone else brings the message to Philadelphia. The day before Christmas, it arrives in Philadelphia. It's printed up. The day after Christmas, one of the tea ships arrived in the Delaware River. And a delegation goes from Philadelphia to Chester, Pennsylvania, to tell the ship to stop. The captain and the master of the cargo are brought to Philadelphia. This is the morning after Christmas, and there are 5,000 people waiting for them outside of the State House in Philadelphia. And they say, you have to turn the ship around and take it back. You can't unload the tea. And they say, well, we'd like to do that, but we don't have any food or water. They say, we'll supply the food and water. So the ship leaves Philadelphia with its tea, goes back to England. A ship arrives in New York. The governor there, Governor Tryon, the same guy we were talking about with North Carolina, is now the governor of New York. He says, no, we'll unload the tea. But he discovers that he can't. The tea cannot be unloaded in New York, not even by Governor Tryon. Another cargo goes to South Carolina, and there it is unloaded, put in storage, and it is only released in 1778, by which time it's gone bad. In April of 1774, a tea ship arrived in the Chesapeake Bay, and the owner of that ship realizes, now I'm in really big trouble because I'm not supposed to sell any tea. So he does the only thing he can think of to spare himself, which is to set the ship on fire at the dock in Annapolis. Because he knows he's run afoul. Something has really changed here with the tea. Tea now is forbidden. And if you are drinking this tea, you are allowing yourself to be part of the East India Company's attempt to enslave you. So this is really what's happening here. Now, by the way, the value of the tea was about $1.7 million in today's money. So it's quite a significant thing. By the way, Benjamin Franklin thinks what you've done now, you've proven your point. Maybe you should pay the company for your tea, then they'll be on your side, since your argument really isn't with the company, but with the parliament. That doesn't work. Meanwhile, it turns out that Franklin's hearing before the Privy Council was scheduled for mid-January, and it happens just 2 days after London had learned about the destruction of the tea. Now remember, this tea belonged to members of Parliament. And this is really the moment when Parliament says, these people have gone too far. They have destroyed our property. So Parliament is going to get tough. And it does a number of things to get tough. One is to suspend the Massachusetts government. You're not going to have that charter anymore. The governor is going to appoint all of the local officials, the sheriffs, the tax collectors, and so on. You can't have these nonstop town meetings. You can have a town meeting once a year, and you have to have the governor's permission. Also, the Port of Boston is closed until you pay for the tea that you destroyed. And also, well, first, Benjamin Franklin does have his hearing before the Privy Council, and Franklin had prepared for this, but the Privy Council hearing turns into a 2-hour harangue by Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General, blaming Franklin for all of these troubles because Franklin had stolen Thomas Hutchinson's letters, taken things that did not belong to him and given them to someone else. And Wedderburn said he will hereafter cringe at being called a man of letters. He's shown himself to be nothing more than a common thief. And then Franklin is stripped of his position as the Postmaster General. By the way, Franklin had thought that maybe the Privy Council could replace Hutchinson with someone better able to get along with these people in Massachusetts, better able to conciliate, because he wanted to save the British Empire, which he loved. He had succeeded because of the empire. And he stood there. By the way, everyone who was anyone in British society turned out for this hearing of the Privy Council. And Franklin stands there silently while Wedderburn is attacking him for 2 hours. And they're all enjoying this. People he thought were his friends, people whose club he had belonged to, people he knew. And they like seeing Dr. Franklin being taken down a few pegs. Here, Wedderburn says, he doesn't come here as the agent of a provincial assembly. He imagines himself to be an ambassador from an independent empire. Who does this guy think he is? He's a nobody from Philadelphia, and people are enjoying seeing Franklin getting his due. Franklin, as I said, came to this meeting, arranged this meeting, hoping that this meeting could save the empire, and he leaves thinking the empire is not worth saving. And this is a major thing in terms of the revolution, because Franklin genuinely wanted to save the empire up till this moment. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. We'll see you again on Monday. If you have any questions, you can email me. Otherwise, go forth, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a
Take
great
care.
weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.